Executive Director of Foundation. Please welcome Blake Truitt, Executive Director of Foundation Relations at The Atlantic.
Thank you. Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Blake Truitt, Executive Director of Foundation Relations at The Atlantic. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Race and Justice at the Atlantic Festival. As you know, there's been a national reckoning with the racial disparities in our criminal justice system, and this summit has been a part of that reckoning. Today is the latest in a series of discussions that the Atlantic has hosted in cities across the country, including New Orleans, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Houston. We've talked with DAs, police chiefs, community activists, and public defenders, all in an effort to explore ways to increase public safety while reducing jail populations to create alternatives to incarceration and to heal from tragedy. Today, we'll bring you other leaders, local and national, who are also moving the needle. We'll hear about the challenges and opportunities facing Chicago's reform-minded prosecutor, the debate over voting rights for felons in Florida, and how bail reform is changing the legal system nationally. And we'll hear from women seeking justice right here in the district. Each of these sessions asks the question, what should be criminalized in the United States? How do we think about punishment? Should it extend after time served to the ability to vote, find a job, and rebuild a life? Before we begin, I'd like to thank the MacArthur Foundation's Safety and Justice Challenge for their support of the Atlantic Festival and for making today's conversation possible. I'd also like to thank Gallup for the use of this space today and ask Mohammed Yunus, the editor-in-chief of Gallup News, to share some of their work.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Gallup. Welcome back for those of you who were with us last night. On the issue of race and justice, I can't imagine a group that is more informed on this topic and does not need a 60-slide PowerPoint presentation on the data and the disparities in perceptions of both the efficacy and fairness of the criminal justice system here in America. So I'll spare you that presentation. But since we are here to talk about criminal justice reform, I did want to mention something Gallup has been involved in that you may not be aware of. For the past several years, we've been taking some of our best sciences and tools around talent and skills development and some of our best strengths coaches and taking them into the prison system across a couple of states here in the United States. And we've worked with now hundreds of folks who are incarcerated. And these coaching sessions and the tools that we provide have really enabled many of those who've gone through the program who are incarcerated to not only understand at a deeper level their own unique talents and strengths, but really to drive self-awareness, confidence, and capability. And what we find through this program, and we've done it now in several locations, is that those who go through the program are actually much more successful at leaving the institution to more successfully achieve gainful employment, to live more fulfilled lives, and to avoid recidivism. So while the conversation around criminal justice reform rightly should be focused on jurisprudence and due process, I wanted to encourage you all to think about non-legal tools that could also foundationally change the experience that citizens have in prison and the tools they need to succeed once they come out. I would be remiss not to mention on the data front that October is the month that we here at Gallup update our national poll on American perceptions of crime, the criminal justice system, and prisons. So be on the lookout for our new data that will be rolling out over the next 2 weeks on our digital newspaper called news.gallup.com. We welcome you all here. Thank you for coming and enjoy the panel.
Thank you, Mohammed. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please silence your cell phones, but have them nearby to contribute to the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag RaceJusticeDC. And we'll want to hear from you in the room as well as we take some questions near the end of the discussion. And with that, please welcome from Chicago, Kimberly Fox, Cook County's state's attorney.
almost 2/3 of the vote in the primary, 3/4 of the vote in the general election. And you were at the forward edge of kind of the movement of more reform-oriented prosecutors who have, kind of emerged in the last few years. And not only were you at the forward edge, you kind of jumped into the deep end of the pool in Chicago, which has been called the city of broad shoulders, but in my experience could also be called the city of sharp elbows. It is a tough place.
Yeah.
You've now been at this for 2.5 years. Talk a little bit about what you have learned that is relevant perhaps to others looking at reform, about what it takes to change a system as big, complex as the criminal justice system.
Sure. So first, good afternoon, everyone. When I took office in 2016, it was a really tumultuous year, not just in the city of Chicago, but across the country around the criminal justice system, police accountability, and the like. We had a very notable case, the Laquan McDonald homicide at the hands of a police officer, and there was a real rallying cry among activists and advocates around the justice system. What most people probably in this room would know is most people don't know what the prosecutor does. It's one of those under the radar races where most prosecutors sit in those roles for really long periods of time. I think the research has shown about 85% of elected prosecutors run unopposed. That's not me. But no one knew what the role was. And so in 2016 in Chicago, there was this energy and this who is accountable for the justice system that we have right now. And Chicago had a long history before Laquan McDonald of a justice system that had been grossly unfair, particularly to communities of color. We had a police commander named Burge who wreaked havoc on the south side of Chicago for almost 2 decades, eliciting false confessions for men that landed many on death row. Ultimately, we abolished the death penalty in Illinois as a result of what was happening with the corruption related to John Burge. And so there was this long history, and then there was this culminating moment with Laquan McDonald. And it wasn't so much that it was I who came in and said, we should change this. I think the people on the ground, the people in the neighborhoods, the people who had been activated said we could and should do better. And so that mandate gives you the space, it gives you the room. I ran on a different type of platform. I ran as someone who came from the neighborhoods that have been impacted by the justice system. I grew up in public housing in Chicago. I grew up in one of the most notorious public housing projects in the country, Cabrini Green. I ran talking about, the history that I had in my family, whether it was sexual trauma or mental health or drug abuse, and how that shaped me and the possibilities and how our system treats those folks.
So where did you start? I mean, can you steer a different direction with the same crew? No. Did you have to do a lot of personnel changes? I mean, where did you kind of begin to kind of rethink your office and what it does?
I used to work in the office,
right.
And so I knew where the mindset was. Most people who go into this field go into it because they want to be a help to their community. I think for a lot of folks, if you've been in that work for 30 years, if you've been in that work at the start of the war on drugs, and you were believed and indoctrinated to believe that drugs and people who sold them and people who used them are criminals, that even as the evolution of justice changes, it's hard to unlearn certain things.
Sure.
And not that it was with ill intent, but what we realized was there's a lot of strong institutional knowledge and good people who are doing the work. The cultural shift around the evolution of criminal justice meant that we had to bring in new blood. So we had some turnover, but we did it, I think, in a way of respect of these are changing times and not it's us versus you, like old versus new. Because I do believe that there are people who've been in that job for a long time who have the capacity to evolve just as many others have.
You've worked with 2 different mayors who are different. You want to?
Yeah.
I
have the tiniest ears.
Yeah, let's come off your ear.
The guy's going to be really upset because he taped this 3 times.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do it like this.
But you work with Rahm Emanuel, and now you're working with Mayor Lightfoot. What is the relationship like between your office and the mayor's office? How much do they affect your daily life? What you can do, and how would you describe the different mayors in their approach and their style?
Hey, I see what you're doing there.
Yeah.
I think that having the mayor's input or a seat at the table is absolutely essential. I think, the previous mayor, was very committed to Chicago being on the national stage as a world-class city. And I think we all share that sentiment. I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. However, in the projection of the world-class city, there was a tendency to minimize the impact that violence was having on communities, minimize the distrust that communities, particularly communities of color, had. And so the level of engagement was very different. And I think there was a real growing animosity from people on the ground who say, listen, we could use the resources of the city. We're not an afterthought. We cannot talk about policing and not talk about prosecution. And the mayor controlled the police department and how you use resources. Ultimately, we ended up having, a federal monitor come in. We have a federal consent decree that happened under the previous mayor. And I think there's a real opportunity, and I'm hopeful that the current mayor believes that, for the city to take a lead role on reform, for the city to be able to be, thank you. I tried.
Yeah. All right, free at last.
Oh my gosh. For the city to use its vast resources, and whether that's through the Park District and programming for young people after school, whether it's, the sanitation or streets department to make sure we have appropriate lighting in places, that conversation wasn't happening in the previous administration.
Now it's more?
Now it's more. I've met with the mayor on multiple occasions talking about gun violence, talking about bail reform, talking about juvenile justice reform. The current mayor served on my transition committee. She's a former federal prosecutor, and she served on our committee talking about guns. And so she understands the significance of having a leader who understands those issues and knows that she is required to be at the table.
You touched on this a little bit in your answer, but Chicago kind of emerges in the national headlines sometimes for these questions of police behavior, police conduct, and the distrust in communities of color, and all of those questions. And sometimes it emerges in the national headlines because it has spikes in violence. I mean, you have both issues that you are dealing with that affect often the same communities. Is solving one in tension with solving the other, or are they kind of, is there a synergy in trying? Is reform inimical to safety?
You cannot have public safety without reforming the criminal justice system, period. This is not this weird false narrative that is put out there oftentimes by others in law enforcement that criminal justice reform is going to make us less safe. The lack of legitimacy of our criminal justice system is why we don't have safety in the neighborhoods that need them most. If I tell you that the neighborhoods that have the highest incidence of violence have the lowest confidence in our justice system,
right,
and you believe that putting more police resources there is going to solve for it, you'll watch this crazy spiral. You must legitimize. When I talk about Burge, the reason I talk about that is that if I live in a neighborhood where the police previously came in and ran roughshod, treated us with disrespect, when something happens, do I trust myself to handle this better, or do I trust the police? If I know, we have vacated convictions of over 66 men and women as a result of a corrupt police sergeant, Sergeant Watts, who was going into a public housing project and was shaking down people who had been engaged in drug sales. If you don't pay me, I'm going to put a gun on you. If you don't pay me, I'm going to put drugs on you. And I think what people think, well, that bad person, but the people who live on that floor, who live in that building, who know who Sergeant Watts is, and who the tentacles go far, and it goes generationally. If it's not just you, if I'm the son of the person who has gone to prison for a crime they didn't commit, that narrative continues to grow. And if you don't own that, if you are afraid to be accountable to that, you are never going to make inroads in those communities.
When you said when something happens, you take care of it yourself, what is the something in that?
It could mean violence. If someone harms me, am I going to trust a system that, if I looked at the numbers, that historically hasn't protected me, to stand in my stead? Or will I take care of it myself? And so I think what you see is what some would call street justice, that I'd rather take care of this in the street. It's probably a lot more immediate than the criminal justice system and its slow processes. It's probably more gratifying that I'm the aggrieved one and I'm exacting what comes from that. And it's probably less exposure to you and those around you to a system that could ultimately do harm to you.
There was a report that came out this summer by a coalition of groups, I think should be noted, generally sympathetic to your approach, that said in your second year, the number of people sentenced to jail or prison has declined by about 19%, while violent crime is also down by about 8%. We'll unpack those. What have been the steps that allow you to get that large a reduction in the number of people being incarcerated? What have been the kind of the individual pieces that you had to pursue to get to kind of that level of change?
I think we started out with what are our resources and how are we using them. In 2016, we had over 760 people in the city of Chicago who were victims of homicide. We had 3,400 people who were victims of shootings. 3,400 people. I have an office that has 800 lawyers. We're second only to Los Angeles. Los Angeles only deals with felonies. In Chicago and Cook, I deal with felonies, misdemeanors, juvenile, traffic, child support, appeals. And by the way, we are also the lawyer of record for the county on the civil side. So we defend them in medical malpractice, torts, workers' compensation, labor and employment. That's my office. So I have this incredible rate of violence. I have a mandate and a staff that, even though 800 seems large, so what we said was, I care about violence. How are we spending our resources? And I looked at a number of offenses. So if 2016, bloodiest year in 20 years, our number one referred prosecution in 2016, when we looked at the data, I think data is incredibly important, was retail theft. So for those of you who aren't, it's shoplifting.
Yeah.
And why is that? Illinois has one of the lowest felony thresholds for retail theft in the country. So Indiana, their threshold is $750. In Wisconsin, $2,000. Minnesota, $1,000. Indiana, $700. In Illinois, it's $300. And so when your threshold is that low, when you talk about catching easy prey, no one wants anyone to steal from merchants. But if the number one prosecuted crime isn't guns in a city that's bleeding out, but retail theft because the threshold is so low. So that was the first thing we did. We said, let's be more in line with other jurisdictions. So I said, using our prosecutorial discretion, we would charge anything under $1,000 as a misdemeanor. People would still be charged, still be prosecuted. It would be a misdemeanor. That saw the greatest reduction. So in 2017, the number one referred prosecution to our office was guns, as it should be. The other thing that we saw was we were prosecuting people for driving on suspended driver's licenses because they could not pay their tickets. And I say, if you've ever seen the movie It's a Beautiful Mind, where the math is doing this, picture this. We are incarcerating and prosecuting you because you can't afford to pay a ticket and your license was suspended, so you may not be able to get to and fro to work. And so I'm going to put you in jail where you're not able to generate money to pay the ticket to not go to jail. I had 10 lawyers assigned to do that work. Now, it's easy to get the person driving on a suspended license. It's harder to get the person who shot someone. It's why we have a homicide clearance rate in Chicago that is significantly lower than the national average. A year ago, our...
Can I interrupt there one quick?
Yeah.
Is it significantly different on the south side and the north side, the clearance rate? Is it lower on the south side?
I think holistically, the clearance rate was 18%. 18%. 18% of our homicides were being cleared closed. It means 82% of our homicides were not being solved. But we were catching everybody who was driving on a suspended license for not paying their ticket. We got those folks who were shoplifting from TJ Maxx.
And is that clearance rate something that, is that ultimately police resources as well? Or is that, can you change that from your office significantly? Or ultimately the police have to have a different focus as well?
I think it's all of it. I think from the police standpoint, resources, right? If I have limited resources, the city of Chicago, the county, the CPD represents only one of my police departments. I have 130 other police departments, to be clear. They are our largest. But if your resources aren't going to solving the most violent crimes, if we are more of processing low-level offenses, then you aren't able to dedicate what you need, the detective resources and the like. I think they've been overwhelmed. I think they want to solve these crimes. I think it's incredibly important, you're right, on the south and west sides, which are predominantly African-American communities, with a clearance rate that low, again, street justice.
Yeah.
But again, if you can't solve for it, if people can kill with impunity and you live in the same neighborhoods as those folks, there is a sense I'd rather take care of this myself.
You are in the same position, I think, as other reformers, where the relationship it maybe is most fraught with the police union, right? And they wrote a letter recently, a deep mistrust now exists between your office and ours. We no longer believe that your office will treat our members fairly, either in the arrests they make or when they are victims of crime. Obviously, after the Jussie Smollett case, that exacerbated it. Is that just inherent in, if you want to be a reforming prosecutor, do you have to accept that conflict with the police union is part of the course, or is there a way that you can work better and kind of have less conflict with that force in the community? Or is it just go with the job now? If you want to go in the direction you want to go, this is like what comes with the territory.
I think I've always been clear when I came into this office that there were things that we were going to need to do, like be accountable to the people that we serve. It's one of the reasons that I have our data. We're the first prosecutor's office to put every charging decision we've made on an open data portal so people can check our work. And I think what we've found is historically prosecutors and law enforcement partners have been, joined at the hip. And it really is about checks and balances. And I think the moment that you start doing the check and trying to balance, then the accusation comes that you are either with us or against us. And that is incredibly problematic. I have and believe wholeheartedly that the legitimacy of our law enforcement partners, their credibility in the community, is critical to my success as a prosecutor. I need them to be legitimate. I need them to be credible.
You need witnesses.
Because they are who brings us the cases. They are an essential element to what we do. And so I think what I've seen, during the course of my time and in other prosecutors' offices across the country is that the union has believed that reform, anything short of, because I'm told, you need to lock up everyone we bring you. And I'm telling them, I need to make sure that we're ensuring public safety by going after those who are harming community. That the evolution of criminal justice to the recognition now, I think it's universally accepted that drug addiction is a public health issue. Is it universally accepted? The opioid epidemic has taken hold of so many communities. We all understand that people need treatment, not incarceration. 6 out of the top 10 cases that are referred to our cases are drug possession cases.
And you're actually now in a process of expunging some of those.
Yes.
Talk about that. Explain that. Apparently, it's National Expungement Week. I did not know that there was, but
you are on topic.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. We knew, so for example, marijuana legalization, as we saw marijuana becoming legal across the country, it had not yet become legal in Illinois, I could not, as a prosecutor, in good faith, prosecute people for doing things that across a border would be legal. I also didn't think it was appropriate that those people who are now going to be able to make billions by the metric ton, John Boehner and his friends,
It's moved on from the Merlot.
Yeah.
Just,
and the cigarettes.
just checking.
Yeah. Are going to make a lot of money off of this. And neighborhoods that have been decimated, where the economy in those neighborhoods have largely been dependent on street sales, are going to labor under convictions. And so we announced before legalization took hold in Illinois that we would be vacating the convictions of anyone who was possessed with 30 grams or less, going back as far as our records would allow us to do. And so we
Only possession, not sale? Or sale as well?
So far, only possession.
But so far, meaning you'd like to get to sale?
Yeah, I believe in one, we partnered with a group called Code for America to help us do this in bulk. We also put this into the state legislation that now marijuana will be legal January 1st. It is now written into the legislation that statewide those records will be vacated. To the tune that is estimated of about 770,000 records will be eligible to have the convictions vacated. That will be life-changing for someone who's not able to get a job, who is reluctant to check the box on an application. And I think the safest place has been for those who have been in possession. But again, it is difficult for me to reconcile that people will literally be making billions of dollars in sales, and that those others who that was their only economy in sales are still locked out. And so people can petition to us, and we'll review the cases case by case, but the automatic expungement, again, no one has to come to us and ask us. We are doing this on our own accord. But people can still petition to us even if they've been engaged in sales, to have those records.
Bring in the audience in one second, but let me just a quick follow-up, because this really gets at kind of the political challenge of reform. You may improve tens of thousands of lives by doing this, stabilize families, help stabilize communities, and 7 of the people who get expunged are going to go back and sell drugs and get arrested, and it's going to be on the front page of a newspaper. Are you confident that your community is willing to look at this in the totality and kind of consider both sides of the ledger? Or when you inevitably get the headline of one person who you've expunged is a recidivist, do you think that that's going to threaten the entire project?
I think the history of criminal justice reform in this country has been, as far as we swung on a punitive side, it has largely been something happened.
Yep.
Someone goes down to the state capitol, they slap someone's name on it, it's Kim's Law now, and then we move it. As we move to the other side, I think we have to brace ourselves for the difficult conversations that the reform and being on the cutting edge of it means. In this human endeavor, someone's going to do that. But I think if you operate in tepidness, if you operate in that incremental fear, the fact that 770,000 records are eligible right now, and that there might be 7 or 70 folks who do something wrong, I can't be worried about that. I think that's how we've gotten the over-incarceration levels that we've had, is because we've been so wedded to incremental change out of fear of making wholesale change and making people uncomfortable.
Somebody should write that down. Okay, audience, your turn. In the back.
Hi, my name is Tracy Hightower. I'm just very interested in criminal justice and the systems we use right now to incarcerate people. And if you're going to release 750,000 folks who have, been unjustly imprisoned, what happens to all of the facilities? Because that's a lot of people.
Well,
yeah, and I should be clear, it's not people, it's the records. So we're going back decades. And so
how many people is it?
So we're trying to suss that out. Are there multiple records per person? We know that it will be over 100,000 folks.
Wow.
So those people, most of them aren't in jail anymore. And that's the other thing. Like, we get the arrest, we'll make it, most people will get probation. They may not even get a prison sentence on these low-level felonies. Again, why we have to think about what we're doing here. They're not going to prison for long periods of time on these low-level drug cases. The conviction lasts with them a lifetime. The collateral consequences of that conviction last far beyond what a traditional sentence will be. And so the facilities will continue to have people. I mean, I think it's my goal that if we're going to use incarceration, we should use it for people who are a threat to our public safety, not to people who annoy us. Because we would be beyond capacity.
Let's get one more.
Hi, Judith Brown, Dianis from Advancement Project. So I have a question about police unions, because you didn't finish your point about the way in which unions are getting in the way. There was a piece in the New York Times today about the fact that we can't get rid of mass incarceration unless we do something about the police. And so I'd like for you to finish your point about the police unions and what you've been trying to do about it.
Yeah, it's been a really difficult relationship because they are protecting the interest of their members. And so that level of advocacy sometimes affords them an opportunity to walk away from conversations. I think the public has to hold police unions accountable. I think the conflation of the good work that the men and women of our law enforcement do on the front lines and what happens with unions, we have to separate that out. Like, there's the police and then there's the police union. And I think the demand for criminal justice reform requires that we demand that everyone sits at the table. And that's not a demand that I can make alone. I assure you I make that demand often. But I think the public at large has to make that demand. We're seeing it in Chicago with the consent decree.
So when you were talking a few minutes ago about convictions, I was thinking in the last half hour how much conviction you have displayed about this mission that you're on. And it really has been a terrific conversation. Would you join me in thanking the state's attorneys in Cook County, Kimberly Fox? Thank you so much. I guess we're going off this way.
Up next to discuss the way forward for women seeking justice in D.C., please welcome Michelle Garcia, Director of the D.C. Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants. Sherry Davis, Speaker with Community Family Life Services, and Paula Fitzgerald, Executive Director of IUTA. Here to join them is the Atlantic's Adrienne Green.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for being here. DC is facing a number of issues when it comes to criminal justice reform, and those issues are oftentimes, compounded and exacerbated for women entering the system. We also know that victims of gender-based violence and the incarcerated are not mutually exclusive groups. Often they're one and the same. So I want to just kind of back all the way up and wonder if you guys can talk about some of the challenges that women who are incarcerated face.
So, yeah, I'm happy to start. Good afternoon, everyone. One of the biggest challenges, and I would say probably the primary challenge that we see, is this false dichotomy that we've created between victim and perpetrator. And that our criminal justice system is really predicated on the separation, and that those two entities or those two identities never overlap. And what we know when we look at women who are involved in our justice system, the overwhelming majority of them have victimization histories, and all of them have trauma histories. And if they didn't have a trauma history prior to incarceration, they absolutely have one post-incarceration. And our system is not really set up to address those victimization needs, those trauma needs. And we know that that's critical because hurt people. And if we don't transform our pain, we transmit our pain. And until we start addressing some of those underlying causes that sometimes lead someone on that pathway into the justice system, we'll continue to see that revolving door.
Sherry?
Okay, so what I would say is that being incarcerated as a woman, I was incarcerated and for about 22 months, and being incarcerated as a woman, I was not prepared to experience the experiences as a woman, like being incarcerated and being on your cycle and not having sanitary products provided for you. So you kind of stick together. The ladies in there will kind of help you out and give you stuff, but you're not even supposed to accept anything from anyone. So you're either going to be ashamed or embarrassed with how you're presenting, or you're going to be in violation of a policy. And which will in turn result in you possibly losing your good days. And anyone that's ever been incarcerated, they have one goal in mind that is always unequivocally the same, and that's to go home. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to risk anything that's going to jeopardize you getting home sooner rather than later. So you bear that shame, and that's just one thing I could tell you. There are hundreds of others types of violations and injustices and civil disrespect that you experience. You lose your civil rights. You're not supposed to, but you do. So that's one thing we need to be mindful of to any woman who's been incarcerated and you're dealing with her, because that, as she said, hurt people. So you are definitely hurt while you are incarcerated. Even if you wasn't hurt before, you have been hurt by being incarcerated. So now you're damaged when you come home.
Michelle, you work with the DC government. How are you thinking about both advocating for victims and thinking about compassionate reform, kind of taking in all of the trauma that they experience into account?
So the agency that I work for, the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, actually used to be two separate entities. It used to be the Office of Victim Services and the Justice Grants Administration. Office of Victim Services did very much what it sounded like, but our Justice Grants Administration really focused on the criminal justice efforts that we have around reform, around a fair administration of justice in the district, and those two agencies were brought together about 4 or 5 years ago. And it really presented an opportunity. There were some folks who I think were concerned about the merging of those entities. But when we look at the populations our agency touches, victims of crime, justice involved individuals, so incarcerated and returning citizens, youth and adults, and youth who are at risk for truancy or juvenile delinquency, we recognized immediately those are not mutually exclusive populations. And the common thread across those populations is trauma. And so we've really focused our efforts on both meeting people where they're at in their lived experiences and prioritizing addressing trauma. So putting resources into both enabling our grantees. We fund about 110 different organizations in the district to enhance their ability to address the trauma needs of the people that they serve and to bring those services to people in the communities where they're at. And we have really strong partnerships with some of our justice system partners who are doing amazing work. Our Department of Corrections is focusing on addressing trauma, and we are funding trauma-specific services within our corrections, which is unusual, I think, across the country. So we're really trying to address the needs of the people who are in our systems.
That brings up a really important point, I think, about mental health care as a vehicle to address trauma. Sherry, I want to ask you a little bit more about your experience being incarcerated in the District of Columbia and just what that was like. You mentioned access to women's products and sanitary pads, and that there are a range of ways that, you know, it's not necessarily set up to accommodate women for their needs, and I think mental health and, you know, other things are definitely a part of that.
Yes. So the majority of my time was spent at in a federal facility. Only about the last 30 days of my time was spent here in the city. But there's everything that you have to get through commissary. So if you want sanitary products, you have to buy them through commissary at like $5 or $10, depending. There's supposed to only be a 30% markup, but it's like hundreds of dollars. The markup is insane. So you really can't afford, if you want to eat other than what's in the dining hall, if you want to eat something else, then you can't afford to buy the sanitary products, or you can't afford to buy everything like you get a headache or you're sick and you don't go to sick call, or you have no money to go to sick call, and they tell you when you do go to sick call to go to commissary and buy aspirin or allergy meds. That doesn't work for anything if you're really sick. Mental health is non-existent, almost non-existent in facilities. They basically have what's called pill line. So if you, like, I was on anxiety meds. So when I first arrived, the first thing they did to me was make me take all these vaccinations. All of my vaccinations were up to date. So there's no way around it. So they gave me vaccinations, but apparently you're not supposed to get vaccinations in the same arm. So they gave me the vaccinations in the same arm, and my arm swelled up to 10 centimeters, and all they did, and I couldn't lift my arm, and I was literally dying. This is day 2. I was walking across the field trying to get to sick call, not knowing I was out of bounds and was about to get a shot, which is like a disciplinary action, but I couldn't move my arm, so I'm about to faint. Like, I was dying. And when I finally went in there and I took my shirt off, they was like, oh my goodness, all they did was draw on me a Sharpie pen to see how big it was, because I had swelling. For anybody in the medical field, I had edema in my arm and the swelling, and it was this big on top of my arm. They didn't give me anything, and I was at a work camp, so they made me go to work. And apparently, as they explained it to me, vaccines put a little bit of something in you to make your body develop antibodies to it. I had 2 different types of whatever in me fighting off within my body, which caused my body to react that way. Mm-hmm. So it turns out I had to rely on a stranger. One of the ladies who was there with me was a former nurse, and she gave me an old antacid, which used to be an early allergy pill, and that made the swelling go down, but the prison didn't do anything. I was literally dying, and they didn't do anything. And so I had to rely on a stranger to help me, which I shouldn't have took the what she gave me, but I had no choice. And I was taking a risk. We both were, because I could have gotten in trouble, she could have gotten in trouble, but it was like either I die behind the wall or I take what she's giving me. So I chose option B.
That's just one example, I think, of
That's just one.
That's one of what I imagine are many examples of kind of improper treatment in the system. Did you ever feel empowered to kind of raise the flag or, file a complaint? Just talk to me about the experience of you and the women that you knew and coming to terms with having to report these kind of conditions.
I filed a lot of what they called administrative remedies. I filed a lot. Because I had never been in any trouble, so I was just a regular law-abiding citizen before my conviction, so I wasn't prepared for all of these injustices you face. Like, you have asthma and they don't want to give you your inhaler. They take all your inhalers. Or you have a deformity in your feet and they're making you wear combat boots and won't give you a soft shoe pads. That's something simple that's not costing them anything, but they won't do it. Or you need a van pass and you're not getting it, or you need allergy medications. I have an EpiPen allergy to cats, dogs, grass, mosquitoes, you name it. And I went to a prison with a dog camp, and it's on a mountain with all grass, and they would not give me any allergy medications. They told me to buy the allergy pills from commissary, which I think 10 pills come in a bottle, so to get enough to last a 30-day supply, and the pills are like $9.80 or something like that. So to get a 30-day supply, I would need like $40 extra per month placed on my books, but every dollar that I received went against my FRP, which is if you have restitution, which I did, and it was insane amount of money that the more money you get in, the more your restitution payment goes. So there were women in there paying like $900 a month for restitution. Like, there were people in there paying, mine went up to $270. And I told that man, I said, listen, my anxiety is up. I don't care what you do. I'll sleep on the bus stop. I'll do whatever. And the bus stop is like, see how we're in this room with these bright lights? That's the bus stop. You out in the open with bright lights on you where you sleeping and there's no privacy or anything. So I was like, I'm not paying that money. It's no way I can afford that. And I only make $5 a month on my job in prison. It's like, and if you refuse, that it's very traumatic. And you have no medications for anxiety or any mental health issues at all.
I'm so glad that you talked about kind of your willingness to go forward and make those complaints. Paula, I want to bring you in because you work a lot with the immigrant community here in DC, who, for a variety of reasons, we're talking about it backstage, are feel less empowered about coming forward. And I wonder if you could just talk about what are you hearing from those women when you're speaking with them?
Yes. So, as you all know, there's an increase in detention for immigrant families who are crossing the border and immigrants who are here without documentation, both women, men, and children. That's a great problem that we see from our client community. And then another issue, Ayuda represents a lot of domestic violence survivors and survivors of other gender-based violence like human trafficking and sexual assault. And we're seeing that people are much more fearful of reporting because they would be reporting to a government actor who they are also scared of because of the of ICE, of the threats of the administration. And so, it's an interesting situation that's causing a lot more victimization, and also I think making us all less safe because immigrants are, the climate at the moment makes people fearful of reporting the crimes for which they are victims, and so perpetrators can just continue to perpetrate whatever crime it is.
Paula and Michelle, I kind of wanted your thoughts around what does work when a victim wants to come forward and they do want to report kind of within the boundaries of the system that exists, kind of what is working and what isn't.
Yeah. So we do have a number of people who come to us who have not reported their victimization. We have holistic legal services and social services. That works. So our attorneys will do a consultation with the client, will explain the legal form of relief. The client might not be ready to report yet, or they might still be in danger. And so the first thing to do is safety planning. The case manager or social services staff will work with them on that. But the fact that they have an attorney at the same time allows us to do it in a manner that sets them up for success. For example, our clients require certain documentation in order to make their case to immigration. So we make sure that the case manager is aware of, if they're in the process of leaving a dangerous situation, that they're able to take the documentation with them, that they know what they need to take. Our case managers will go with them often to make the report, having kind of someone there supporting them along the way, having an attorney they feel protected, that their rights will be protected as they go through this process and they feel less vulnerable. So I think the holistic services is a very important component.
And I would agree with Paula in that IUTA is one of the many organizations that we fund in the district to provide those support and advocacy services, and that we know from the research that individuals who have those advocates are more likely to engage with the criminal justice system and stay engaged with the criminal justice system because they have that support, but that they're making that informed decision for themselves about what is that right pathway. And so one of the things that we did in 2016 was to launch a citywide victim hotline that is the single point of entry for all victim services in the district, for anyone to access the very types of services that Paula was talking about.
And when you're hearing from these women who sometimes might not have these advocates, we've already talked about how that is, a really great and supportive experience. What are you hearing from them? Do they feel like their lawyers, judges, the people that are kind of dealing with their case, are they listening in most occasions?
There is a great deal of fear to step foot in a courthouse or a police station. So I think a lot of the people we're speaking to just it would not occur to them to go to a police station, to reach out to the police with the idea that they will be helped. So, unfortunately, that's the situation. And then us as attorneys, talk through the situation and can help them when they do feel ready to report the victimization.
Sherry and Michelle, I wonder if you've heard or experienced similar levels of kind of distrust that folks don't connect with the assumption that they will be helped.
We definitely have, and I think part of it, again, is when we look at how our justice system is set up, the victim is ancillary to that system often, that it is the state versus the accused or the perpetrator, and the victim may be a witness in that case. And what we've seen a shift over the past couple decades is really this movement to codify victims' rights within our system so that they have a voice in that process, and that when they're supported by advocates, they can actually feel empowered through that. We know from talking with victims that those who have the opportunity to participate, to confer with prosecution, to say what they want, even if they don't get the outcome they were hoping for, the fact that they were included in that discussion and process leaves them with higher levels of satisfaction about the outcomes than when they're just completely ignored throughout the process. Mm-hmm. But we know it's also critical to get people connected with those services, and in many cases, there's a lack of awareness that those services are available.
I think when you are incarcerated and you are a victim, and you want to complain, you become a target of retaliation. So like me, I didn't know any better, so I was complaining about everything and writing up every violation. I had like 100 administrative remedies, but the main one was, as an inmate, there are two things that I didn't know. Inmates don't have the right to consent to sex. So even if they're engaging in a relationship with an officer or anybody in the facility, even if it's consensual on the inmate's part, they don't have the right to consent, because you are basically in the custody of the government or the state. And the fact that if you do have a PREA, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act complaint, like a male officer should never do a pet down search of a woman in a facility. I have a PREA complaint. I haven't filed it because the one complaint I had, when I did try to file it, they basically swept it under the rug, and I had to get the national PREA office to even make them file a complaint. But I was the victim of a pat down search of a man, and he started at my hips and then went between my legs all the way down. Now ask me what he was looking for. Food. food is contraband in prison. Like, if you're hungry, you can't take the food out of the dining area, and they deem it as contraband, which is not even the correct definition of contraband. And he did all of this on a complaint because I filed a complaint because they did not honor my diabetic meal plan in prison. So the meal plan was not diabetic friendly. So my blood sugar was just off. I couldn't even get the right meal plan. And when I filed that administrative remedy, one of the other officers called in that I had stolen a soda from CDR, and I was the victim of a pat-down search. So now I'm always leery of men that come up behind me or walk close to me or anything, because you cannot be more violated than having a man like start in your crotch and go down your legs, and you're basically helpless to do anything. And when you report it, you're reporting it to someone who works with John, who is the best guy. And though John didn't touch you, because everybody knows he wouldn't. And I said, well, everybody don't know because he did. You know, like it just takes you through so much. And when you do have those complaints, the process right now in the Bureau of Prisons is to separate you, segregate you. So they take you from the compound, almost like in the middle of the night, almost like they're kidnapping you and take you somewhere that is terrible, like to a county facility while they fake investigate. And the conditions are so deplorable that nobody wants to make it known or file a report. They just deal with being victimized like that. And then even having, like when my family came to visit me, every time they came to visit me, I had to have a full strip search of all my cavities for a 90-minute visit. So you have all your clothes are off and they're looking like, and it's very humiliating. You have to spread your cheeks, spread your genital area, open your mouth, shake out your head. It's very demeaning just to be connected to your loved ones for 90 minutes. So this is what women go through in prison.
We're going to take audience questions in just a second, but I have one final question for you all. There is a lot wrong with the system. As far as kind of immediate priorities, what are the changes that you want to see to shift the system toward being more helpful to women?
I would say a decreased use of detention.
I would say having an advocate at the prison to ensure that these things that are not occurring.
And ditto. And that reentry truly starts on day one, so that when we do have people in our systems, that we are providing every resource, tool, and support to make sure they're successful once they leave.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions in the audience? One right here.
1 second.
Oh.
I just have a question. Is it Adrienne? Yes.
Sharon.
Oh, sorry, Sharon. So what happens when people or organizations make attempts to donate feminine products to the prisons?
A lot of times they will say that they cannot receive donations from outside sources. I know where I was at Alderson, Martha Stewart spent time there, and she got the cottages closed down because it was asbestos. Mm-hmm. And she offered, I'm told, to help incur the cost of renovating or doing whatever they needed to do, and they turned her down flat and said it wasn't authorized. It's very hard to navigate within the Bureau of Prisons to do things like that.
So is there, sorry, but by chance, do you know since this seems like a great platform for that, there have been like a lot of different speakers, people that deal with policies. So I think we even had someone like Kimberly Fox. Is anyone here that would possibly be able to help change that?
Well, they have passed laws that they're supposed to provide sanitary napkins. While I was in, they were supposed to provide the sanitary products, but while I was there, the warden had what I call housed everything in storage and was not passing them out. So he had cases and cases and boxes, but wasn't giving them to the ladies. So you just had them on the prison compound and you're not passing them out. He said officially he was trying to figure out the best way to do it, but I might add that the whole lot of them were carted off, and the captain convicted of raping inmates. So they were carted off by the National Guard, but I bet you all didn't hear about it. You know, it was kind of swept under the rug. So the warden was doing other things than trying to figure out how to dispense sanitary products.
We have one more question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Melanie. I'm just interested. This is mostly about funding. Is there anything that you guys are, the statistics that you're given and the statistics that led up to passing the PREA have indicated that the most raped demographic in the United States of America is African American men. So everything you're saying about how victims and victims of childhood violence become perpetrators, I think pertains equally to men and to women. Are you able to allocate funds to help raped men? And do you? And then also, are you seeing specific issues that only pertain to women?
So from a funder's perspective, absolutely. So our focus was on women in the justice system because one of the things we recognize is that many of the responses in our system are designed for the per capita majority of folks who are in that system, which we know are men, and are, in our country at least, largely black and brown men. And because of that, in many cases, the programs that are in place do not address the specific barriers of women in those systems, which is why we were focusing on those issues. But absolutely, the resources that are available for women who experience sexual violence, whether it's while they're incarcerated or before their incarceration, we fund those services as well. The federal funding that's available around sexual assault does not have a limitation on gender. The statute is very clear that they can be used for serving male, female, non-binary victims as well.
Sherry, Michelle, Paula, thank you so much for joining us.
And now for a session produced by our underwriter, please welcome Deanna Hoskins, President of Just Leadership USA, here with Bria Gillum, Program Officer at the MacArthur Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today with Deanna and her fan.
Yes.
First, I want to give a huge thank you to the Atlantic for putting together this incredible program on race and justice. Also, for anyone who hasn't gone to some of the Atlantic Festival events, they're also fantastic. I should note before we dig into our conversation around community engagement that the Atlantic has had complete editorial control over today's race and justice session. So, through our initiative, the Safety and Justice Challenge, the MacArthur Foundation is concentrating its efforts on the front end of the system, which includes our local jails. We're focused on the front end because even though there's more than 600,000 people that enter prisons each year, there's over 11 million people that cycle in and out of jails annually. And of those 11 million, 2/3 of those people have not even been convicted of a crime. And when we look at the actual people who are in our jails, the composition, you'll notice that most of them are low income. They don't have enough money to pay their bail. They disproportionately suffer from mental health issues or substance use, and they're also people of color. So it's for these reasons that the MacArthur Foundation has invested over $100 million since 2015 to build a network of 52 jurisdictions across 32 states here in the US. And it includes national organizations like Deanna's Just Leadership USA. And it's our goal to address the misuse and overuse of jails and also reduce the racial and ethnic disparities that exist across the system. We are focused at the local level, partnering with counties and cities to develop data-driven strategies that really look at who's coming to your jail, why are they even coming to jail, and to come up with solutions and alternatives to incarceration in general. And that's at every stage of the front end of the system, from the time when a person first has contact with the police to when they're actually processed into the jail, to how they're represented, to the disposition of the case. So even though I said the foundation's investment is $100 million, which sounds like a lot of money, it's really not in the bigger picture, in the bigger scheme of things. And I think what we're learning along the way and why we're partnering with organizations like Just Leadership is that it really takes a collaborative effort across multiple systems. It includes the people that we elect into office, and it also includes our communities. And when I say communities, I mean people who've been directly impacted. Either they're victims, either they're formerly incarcerated, or they're both. And it also includes our prosecutors, our judges, our public defenders, so on and so forth. So that's why I'm pleased to be joined with Deanna today. I know she can shed some light on some of these issues. And I know that she's going to talk about how we can make sure that we are being inclusive and equitable when we're talking about community engagement. So Deanna, I wanted to kind of start with the overall question of when we talk about community engagement, you're hearing a lot about the narrative between, well, the community is so disruptive, they don't understand, they're adversarial to the system. And I think in your experience, and from you running a national organization, can you talk a little bit about what we mean by community engagement and how you're able to actually work with those system actors?
So I think we have to first define and understand that the community that's most impacted has never been the community of interest in the criminal justice system. They've always been the recipients of what the criminal justice system has to deliver, whether that's arrest through police, prosecution through prosecutorial. So when we start saying that we need to be in the conversation, that is not traditional. That's not what prosecutors would say, that individuals who I've prosecuted should sit at the table, or police saying people from the community that we arrest should be at the table. So when we say authentic community engagement, it's not bringing the policy to me after you've written it. It's having me in the room while you're even contemplating what the policy should look like. Because you're going to write a policy that's responsive to what you think is happening. I'm going to help you understand a policy that actually heals the harms of that the crime is actually a symptom of. But we never really get to that. So when we say authentic, I use this analogy that diversity is inviting me into the room. Inclusion is my voice being heard once I'm in the room, but equity is allowing me to run the room. And that's a shift in power that has to happen if you're saying you're going to invest in community's best interests, or are you really setting policies that invest in law enforcement, criminal justice best interests?
So I want to follow up on that particular point about making sure that you're in the room, right? In the room where it happens is a Hamilton song that I love. But just to go on a little bit further and to push you a little bit more, how exactly are you getting into that room to make sure that you're making those policies?
So one of the things that we're actually doing with Safety and Justice Challenge is, because we are individuals who are directly impacted, and we're one of the only national organizations that was founded by and ran by directly impacted individuals, we can go into communities who traditionally don't trust criminal justice. You have to remember, most marginalized communities, the only response when the police shows up is to remove someone. So the police is always seen as a harmful aspect of you're plucking someone from our system. And although a crime has been committed, I like for people to understand this. We're looking at family separation now, but we've been separating Black children from their families for years. And all of a sudden, it's all this attention. So when you come into my home in the middle of the night, some experiences of some of the people I work with, on Christmas Eve, and you kick open the door, shake down our house, pluck my parent away and say they'll be back, and they don't come back for 20 years, why would I trust you when as a child, the most traumatic thing as a child, you were the contributor in my eyes? So we haven't really even broke down the distrust of the community with the criminal justice system. When we go to court, we get arrested. So we are able to go in and have authentic conversation with the community. What does your community need? What are some of the things? And I remember doing reentry, and things from reentry were saying they just need a job, they just need housing. But when I went to the community was like, we just need access to basic human needs of food. We just need an ID when we come home from prison so we can access the services. But the elected officials weren't thinking of IDs. They were thinking about somebody need to hire individuals. If I don't have a place to live, if I can't feed my kids, I'm not going to show up for work. So it was just a two-pronged approach that was not having a solution. So having the community state what their needs are from a bottom-up approach, and then working with the system actors to start implementing their needs starts to build the trust, because now they know their voice is being heard and it's becoming a part to heal their community.
So Just Leadership has been leading a few campaigns focusing on closing prisons and jails across the country. Obviously, Close Rikers is the big one happening right now. But when we think about the future of the justice system, right, decarceration is one goal. But what is the next goal after that? What do you think the justice system should even look like after you close down these jails and prisons?
So, one, we have to stop looking at policy currently looks at who's in or out of prison or jail. And we have to start looking at policy of, does this continue to entrench harm, or does it eradicate the existing harm? Because let's be honest, if we keep looking at this system from a policy perspective and not the fact that this system was built on the backs of slavery and that the majority of the prisons that exist were once plantation, that shifted at the abolishment of slavery, but for the 13th Amendment clause that said, except when in a solitude or a confined position, you can have free labor, we're going to keep recreating the harm. And i.e., we're creating policies, and the first thing you hear, we're trying to restore the pale inside prisons, and the first thing people are telling us is everybody but people with life without parole, because they're never coming home, Deanna. But the amount of sentences that are getting overturned, so do I want someone who sat in prison 30 years get their sentence overturned but didn't have access to education because they were life without parole, and then all of a sudden they're walking out the door and they never had access? So what we're doing, we're creating systems of who's privileged and who's not. And let's be honest, Black and brown bodies are never on the top priority of the privilege list.
And that's a great actual segue to the question I was going to ask you. This is a session about race and justice. You just talked about how the system was built on slavery. We all know about the history of structural racism, the culture, the institutionalization of different policies, laws, so on and so forth, that are still entrenched today in our justice system. So what do we do about this? How is Just Leadership thinking about these issues, about the disproportionality of Black and brown people in our jails and prisons?
Glad you asked. So one of the things we have to realize is, when I worked at DOJ, I managed the Second Chance Act portfolio. And it always bothered me. I used to be like, second chance? Black and brown people never had a first chance. But okay. But that's the reality. We never really had a first chance in some of those situations. But so when you look at the entrenched harm, the 1994 crime bill, which actually took out education, access to education. It actually paid states to do truth in sentencing laws and actually accelerate and incentivize them to build prisons with money. So that's what kind of led to some of this. The 13th Amendment clause, it abolished slavery except for when you're confined. So we want the 13th Amendment clause. Why can't individuals who are formerly incarcerated, why can't you explicitly say we're protected class? Because the Civil Rights Act says you can't discriminate against a disparate population. So when you see jobs or housing postings that say no felony convictions, no misdemeanors, they're outright discriminating against African Americans and Latinas who are arrested and prosecuted at a higher rate. But nobody wants to say formerly incarcerated or individuals with felonies are a protected class. And then the last one is, why do we lose our right to vote? Why does, in the United States, we are stripped of everything with a criminal conviction? In Norway, the only liberty you lose when you commit a crime is your freedom. In America, we strip you. You are not considered a citizen. You cannot vote. We then have entrenched Jim Crow laws of where you can work, where you can live now because you have this criminal conviction. So we're asking, if we're a protected class, the Jim Crow laws are banned. Actually, if we never lose our right to fundamentally vote, we're still considered a citizen, and our only liberty that has been taken is our actual freedom. if we repeal the 1994 crime bill, we reduce a bunch of the truth in sentencing that prisons were built on, where they can become factories, whatever. And we restore educational opportunities, which is a basic need. Why are some people to a basic need that we know? Education is a way out of poverty and a way to reduce recidivism. But we have a law that refuses to allow the people we say we want to reduce their recidivism to have access to the key that researchers, that maybe I'm slow, but so these are the things that, you're saying research shows that education is a way out of poverty and reduces recidivism, but the individuals that we keep pumping money into to say to reduce recidivism, we won't get them access to the tools we know that would do it. Because what does education do? Education increases an individual's ability to navigate in a society that we still want to keep people oppressed in.
Well, you've gave us a lot to think about, some great ideas and suggestions. Everyone, please join me in thanking Deanna for today's conversation.
Next, for a conversation on voting rights in Florida, please welcome Neil Volz, Deputy Director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, Tanisha Johnson, Chapter and Membership Coordinator of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and Florida State Senator Jeff Brandes of St. Petersburg. Here to join them is the Atlantic's Van Newkirk.
Thank you. The title of our panel is The Right to Vote, which I believe we will be able to tackle fully in the next 25 minutes. But really, we are going to discuss one of the most significant changes to both voting rights and criminal justice law in the last couple decades in America, and that's Florida's Amendment 4. Now, Neil and Tanisha, you were heavily involved in the passage and the conceptualization of this ballot initiative. Can you tell us more about your getting involved and what the amendment did?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, thank you for having us. We're grateful for the opportunity to talk about this important issue with everybody. And I guess my involvement ultimately started when I got my felony conviction 13 years ago and moved to Florida and realized that we were living in a state that was one of 4 states at the time that permanently barred people for the rest of their life for voting. And by the time I got there, we realized what a huge problem it was that we were looking at 1.5 million people whose voices were silent. That's like saying to the state of New Hampshire or West Virginia, like nobody here can vote. It was a very big problem, and not a whole lot was being done about it. I think you had some good, well-intentioned folks who wanted to try and do something, but ultimately it came down to people who were dealing with the pain of this policy that was broken, led by Desmond Meade, who's the leader of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. He headed up the campaign arm, and ultimately we built a campaign around people. And it was as basic as that. It was about people and people's lives. We did not want ultimately to make this a overtly partisan issue. We wanted to focus on real people's lives and making progress, because, for example, there were 3 carve-outs in the Amendment 4, right? One, it said that if you were found guilty of murder, you did not qualify. If you were felony sexual offenses, did not qualify, and also said that you had to complete all terms of your sentence, right? So for somebody like us, like for me, I'll say, I believe that everybody can be restored. I believe that if you committed murder, you can be restored. That's my belief. But that isn't what we did in Amendment 4. We took a lot of time to try and make a strategic step to move the ball forward. And I think that when we stop for a second and declutter and really think about the fact that there are 1.4 million people in our country last year who were unable to vote for the rest of their life, they can now vote. And that's a huge step forward.
And my story is a little similar to Neil's. I got in trouble back in 2009. I'm a single mother, and I moved to Florida in 2017 with my voting right because my crime happened in Pennsylvania, where they actually restore your voting right. And when I got down here, I actually tried to get a job, and I couldn't get the job because I actually had a second-class felony. And that's when I actually realized how disenfranchised, people like myself are. And I wanted to get involved with FRC, and I got involved, and I've just moved up the ladder. I do this fight for my children. I do this fight for my brother who's incarcerated right now. So I really do this fight with a passion, and just to make sure that my kids don't have to go through this 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Now, Senator, you were an architect for SB 7066, correct? And that piece of legislation is something that's been proven to be pretty controversial in the context of this conversation. Can you tell us about it?
So I'm in an interesting place because I was both an early supporter of Amendment 4 because I saw how broken the former system was. And then I was asked to work on the legislation that helped implement and address those three questions. What is murder? What is a felony sexual offense? These are undefined terms, right? So we needed to add some definition to what those meant. And then, what does the words all terms of sentence mean? What does the word all mean? What does the word terms mean? And what is a sentence? And so what we looked at and determined was that it all meant everything. Terms meant all, kind of everything on the piece of paper, all the obligations were the terms, and a sentence was essentially everything within the four corners of the sentencing documents. And I think that has led to some other discussions, right? What does this mean for fines? What does this mean for fees? What does it mean for court costs? Are court costs part of a sentence? Are fines part of a sentence? Clearly, your term of incarceration is part of a sentence. But what else is part of a sentence? I think the exciting thing is the conversations that are being generated right now about, wait a second, we have a lot of statutory kind of costs into the sentence, into fines and fees that really nobody had looked at in decades. $2 goes here, $5 goes there, $20 goes here. Some of it goes to the victim's trust fund, but those things can't be waived. So part of what we work to do is put together, obviously, the definitions for what is murder, what is a sexual offense, and what are all terms of sentence. But then we went, I think, one step beyond that, which was we tried to provide some mechanism for individuals to go back to court and get their fines and fees reduced. If they had restitution owed, they could go to their victim and get the victim to waive the restitution. We know less than 10% of people owe restitution in the system, but how do we get that waived for them? And so we tried to go a little bit above and beyond that. Now, there's still some controversy around fines, fees, and costs being part of a sentence. That question is both before the federal court and before the state Supreme Court right now as an opinion. So those issues will be resolved, and I have no doubt, based on that resolution, that the legislature will come back if we need to and address that.
Within the context of this new law that everybody's put forward and that's now part of the daily lives of people in the state, it essentially would create a system by which some people will have to pay money to vote, though, correct? Is that what?
Well, they have to complete all the terms of their sentence. And that's the place that the constitutional amendment has put us.
How do you feel about the argument that constitutes maybe a poll tax?
So I fundamentally reject that argument. And I do that because a poll tax was a horrible disgrace upon this nation. But the architects of this legislation clearly had multiple choices of language they could have used. They could have said, no, it's just the term of confinement. But they polled that, and they realized that probably didn't pass. They could have chosen a variety of different ways that this language could have landed on the ballot. But they chose this language, and it says all terms of sentence. And as somebody who has raised my hand and sworn to support and defend this Constitution, I now am bound by the words on the page. And so I have to believe that means all, and all does not mean some.
Now, I want to offer Neil and Tanisha a chance to answer this. What does the phrase all terms of a sentence mean to you?
Well, I would look back on the formulation of the amendment, right? And what it did is that we have aspirational goals and we have beliefs, right? I have spent much of my life working on democracy issues and advancing the cause of democracy. And to be a part of Amendment 4 has been an honor of a lifetime. But we also knew that was aspirational with the conversations that we would have. What we did was actually we went around the state and we talked to the public. We literally did focus groups. We literally talked to people and figured out what is the public willing to accept and move forward with us in this area. And what the public was talking about were these 3 items. One, they said they did not have an appetite for people convicted of murder. They did not have an appetite for people of sex offenses, and there was a belief that a sentence needed to be completed. And so for us, we campaigned on the belief that restitution was a part of the completion of sentence, for instance. You know, I broke the covenant with my community, right? And I believe in restoration. Restoration changes lives, and I believe everybody can be restored. But there is a very real process of making sure that all sides of that conversation are whole so that we can move forward together, create safer communities and better, communities together. And so that we believed that, and we publicly supported Senator Brandis's bill at the very end of the session that included a requirement for restitution. And obviously the words in the Constitution involving probation. I know when I went through probation, to finish probation, there is a financial obligation associated with that. So I think one of the challenges is that people try to figure out what every voter thought, and we're not really going to be able to figure out what every voter thought. We're on the ground right now operating under this law and registering people, and we fought. So there's not a bigger evangelist for democracy than somebody who lost the right to vote and got it back. So we're in the streets, we're talking to folks in our communities, and we're getting people registered under this law, and we're helping them overcome what hurdles are associated with some financial obligations. But we do so knowing that Amendment 4 broke down the wall of the lifetime ban that was put there 150 years ago under Jim Crow, and that is no longer a reality in Florida. So we're ready to keep moving forward. We want to make voting and registering people to vote fun again. So our view is where other people see obstacles, we see opportunities.
Tanisha, the panel before us was on women in the criminal punishment system, on things like reentry. I'm curious as to how, if you've met anybody, if in your experience, you've talked about the ways in which, say, the restoration of voting rights maybe dovetails with some of the other challenges or reductions of challenges to women, specifically within who have been incarcerated, who are returning citizens.
I absolutely come across and have met people that are actually working criminal justice reform, and we have started talks around women's right in voting. And I wouldn't necessarily say that there's not a big difference from men and women when it comes to the restoration of voting rights, because we're in this democracy where it's equality. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we have a big difference, but we're all fighting for the same equal rights.
I'll clarify the question from my reporting on voting rights. We understand that oftentimes when you have one of the bigger obstacles is women find it harder to get off jobs, to juggle between childcare and all these other issues with voting. We know there's a couple more economic, job, just facts of life struggles, especially for low-income mothers, that may be compounded by having a felony charge. Is that something that people have talked about at all?
I can speak from my personal experience. Definitely, when I came home from prison, it took me about 6 months to actually find a job. I got my voting rights back, so that wasn't really an issue for me until I actually moved to Florida. Talking to women in Florida, finding jobs is definitely hard to do, and we encourage entrepreneurship, as so myself have started my own business, so that way I can actually give back to my returning citizens community and make sure that we don't have these obstacles in place.
Now, this is I think the entire audience, this time in America is interesting when it comes to these kind of reforms. There seems to be both a bipartisan opportunity. You've got lots of people on both sides of the political aisle who are discussing ways to just make the criminal punishment system less onerous on people. But also, there seem to be some people who, for political purposes, may not quite enjoy the idea of having more people voting, or maybe thinking about that as political engineering. Senator, I want to ask about, does that tension ever show up in your line of work and then the people that are involved in your caucus?
No, if this language had been written to say, and had it passed, it said, after the term of incarceration, I have no doubt that the legislature would have implemented it so that the term of incarceration was the finality. It doesn't say that. Mm-hmm. It says all terms of sentence. And so the legislature is then put in a place where it has to deal with this all terms of sentence definition. But I know that that's the underlying current, is we'd like to think that there's just this evil intent. I can tell you there is no stronger person for criminal justice reform in the state of Florida than our team and what the Florida Senate's doing right now. We see the utter brokenness of a prison system and a criminal justice system where it stacks the deck against everybody in the system. We see people carrying around felonies like it's Hester Prynne's scarlet letter for the rest of their lives. And we see the injustice that creates. And I hope that we can continue to work on what the definition of fines and fees really means. I think that that's going to be, again, resolved by our courts shortly. But I think it's up to the legislature to look internally and say, guys, look, we have fines and fees out there that make no sense, that are completely disconnected from what the penalty truly should be. For example, if you steal a fish in Florida from an aquacultural facility, it carries a $10,000 fine, right? That makes no sense. But that's what the fine is. I mean, if you go through the Florida code, it's replete with those types of fines, fees, and other costs. But I think what this conversation does is it forces us to have a very detailed, thoughtful explanation for every fine and fee. But because before, the standard was, are you a felon? Are you not a felon? That was how you got to vote. Now it's, we've got to come back and begin to address the harder questions of, are these fines rational? Are they reasonable? Because if they don't, the penalty is individuals can't vote.
What you're speaking to, I believe, is this larger realization now among lots of people tuned into this issue, which is most of mass incarceration operates out of state and local law. Mm-hmm. And I know you've worked on introducing things like the Florida First Step Act. Do you think there's an appetite among states for, say, doing something like that, say, porting the First Step Act into state actionable items?
I think so. And I think it's growing. And I think that's the encouraging thing for me, is that there is a bipartisan group, at least in Florida, there's a bipartisan group that's working to change the overall system. And it starts with diversion. You have to revise the criminal punishment code. We have to fix our prison system. And we have to work on reentry. And there is more work than I could do in 50 legislative sessions. But it took us a generation or two to get to here. I mean, Florida has been a radically changed state over the last few years as it becomes to this conversation on criminal justice reform. It started, I would say, back in 2014, 2015. But I can tell you right now, our prison system is overstuffed with inmates. That we have prisons where I have a 40% vacancy rate of guards because I can't hire guards for $33,000 a year. And that conversation is leading to all the other conversations going on. And people come to it for different reasons, right? The far left may think it's a social justice issue. The libertarians may see it as a liberty issue. The conservatives may see it as a fiscal issue. I don't care how you get there. I just want you there, and I want you working with us. Because I think there are best practices throughout the country that we can follow and we can implement, and we can make both Florida safer and improve the lives of people that are in the system.
Now, Tanisha, we talked backstage about just how many miles you put on the car and the rental cars, canvassing the state, going and meeting all these, a whole bunch of returning citizens. Can you tell us, now that the contours of Amendment 4 and rights restoration in Florida are established, what are the things now that those folks are looking for, need in order to be able to go vote?
Well, the right to vote has been restored, so it's not necessarily that they need anything, because they were given their right back to vote when Amendment 4 passed. So basically what I'm doing is going around the state and building up the momentum to get all of the returning citizens that have their rights restored to vote, encourage them to actually use their voting power. So we're just trying to make our communities more safer.
You find that things like local DAs races are really important in getting people out there?
Well, we're nonpartisan, so we're not really focused on the races, but in our meetings, we're definitely encouraging or making sure that they know how to advocate for themselves. So we're not necessarily focused on any of the political races, but just making sure that everybody is educated about the political system.
Now, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience, so get those ready in your back pockets. Neil, my last question is to you, and it's you've all put together this, again, maybe the most substantive change in American voting laws in quite some time. What's next?
Great question. And I would say that I think one of the things that we've seen as the implementation of Amendment 4 has begun is this cultural shift on the right, the left, and just in the language that we use. I love hearing returning citizen instead of felon. And also this concept that, the theme of the campaign was really 7 or 8 words depending on your use of an apostrophe, right? It's like when a debt's paid, it's paid. And we saw, and we continue to see this kind of challenge over defining when a sentence is complete. And it might be that people didn't want sentences to be complete. And so there's this institutional challenge to ultimately landing in the right spot. But what we see is individuals, human beings embracing this concept that when a debt's paid, it's paid, and we believe that's powerful. We believe that when you begin to talk about economic opportunities, the opportunity to live in a house, after having a felony conviction, access to opportunities and education, that if we truly believe when a debt's paid, it's paid, we can actually begin to mobilize and allow people to live up to their God-given potential, and in the process, create safer communities and a stronger state in Florida, and hopefully be an example to the rest of the nation. We think it's really cool to have been a part of a process in which a bunch of folks that the rest of the community looks at as outcasts was able to put a network together of people who aligned along the lines of humanity and love, not along the lines of hatred and partisan division, but out of the pain of real life came together and decided to say, look, we're the only ones who can make the difference, and began this movement. And that network still lives in the state of Florida. When people voted in November, they didn't vote, when it came to Amendment 4, they didn't vote for a politician, they didn't vote for a partisan ideology or an agenda. They voted for a friend, a family member, a loved one that they knew. And we think those seeds are planted firmly in the soil in Florida, and we're really optimistic about what it means for the future of criminal justice reform, and ultimately just for the lives of people in the state.
Thank you. And let's open up the questions.
All right, that's cool. I got to stand up, right? All right. Hey, my name is Hampton Graham, of course. Support y'all doing y'all movement, allowing people with felonies to vote, because everybody needs to vote regardless of what you done, because everybody does stuff bad. In the day, you got to grow and be prospering in life. So, I support y'all. I appreciate it. Which every state can do that, be open-minded about the same thing, because that's just backwards. Because you're not going to hear the people, hey, he wants to be in office. He has a felony. He can't vote. So how can he show his growth in his education, of his knowledge, his mind, and bring that wisdom to the people? Then we can all support one another, but it's backwards, right? Because I got charges too, so I'm discriminated. I can't walk and say, hey, can I get a job at corporate? No, you got charges. Does my corporate leader do bad stuff? Yes, he does. Does he have charges? I don't think so. But we always like to desensitize that, And I wanted to shed light to, did you guys take this out of the state, out of Florida state, and, do campaign movements? I don't know your position in the politics right now, because I forgot, I'll be honest with you, but can you use your authority to pull the campaign, somehow pull the people that in office, because you guys all talk off work out duties and stuff, but open their mind if they even listen and considering, because the right to vote brings more than just voting. You got to hear the people. People not going to listen to you because you're in office. People listen to people who's in the room right now, who's on the streets, because that brings economic growth, right? You want finances and credits to move, you got to let the people enjoy themselves, be happy. Because if I went to jail, I did go to jail, it sucks in there, brother. They're negative. All I can do is military, or, I want to have that authority role or authority mind. but you ain't gonna live happily. You're gonna be complacent. You
I
know?
want to repackage. So you're asking.
Yeah.
how
Do
can
they bring this campaign out the state of Florida and bring it to other states which is closed-minded, because that's backwards? And do you guys offer everything else outside of voting? Education when they get out, because they can't even socialize correctly when they get out. They're feeling uncomfortable. They feel attacked, but they don't know how to be themselves anymore. They're lost. I can be myself. I got 2 children. I still struggle to get a job, you know?
So let's start with about
Yeah, but
whether we
just
can
can
get it
y'all-
out of
can
Florida.
y'all
Well, we can,
elaborate more
move it out.
outside
Yeah,
of
I think there's a variety of best practices that we're going to identify here and that we can take throughout the states. I think Florida's learning a lot from Texas. Texas was a leader in criminal justice reform. I think as it relates to some of the other states, we're learning a lot, and we need to begin to have the courage to implement it. But I think as it relates to voting, I'm encouraged by where we are, where we're going, and I think once we have a little bit more clarity in a few months, when the court cases are all resolved, we'll be able to continue to work on fines, fees, and costs as to get those down and to true those up.
All right. One more question.
Hi. Thanks to everybody for their work. With an eye on outcomes, I'm just wondering what proportion of returning citizens are not going to be enfranchised because they still owe fines, fees, or restitution?
So the place we go to and have for years is the Sentencing Project, and they're obviously, somebody who works there might be in the room. They're just kind of top of the line in terms of data management and studying stuff. So to the best of our ability, if you look at the 1.4 million people, right, who no longer face a lifetime ban, right, so that's done, right, and now we look at 7066 right now, and again, things are in fluid. To the best of our understanding is that 860,000 people are currently eligible to vote, and 500,000+ people have some sort of financial obligation. Now, in what we're doing, and we're operating under the law. So let me give an example. So in Miami-Dade, the district in Miami-Dade, the local court, state attorney, public defender worked with us, and we have the tools that were put specifically in the legislation to allow for the modification of sentences for people who have financial hardships. There's about 158,000 returning citizens in that district. About 75,000 of those folks are probably eligible under these programs to get their financial obligations modified. And so we have to allow for us to work underneath the law with the tools that are given in there to actually allow people who have financial obligations to work through these programs. We also have a fines and fees fund that we're using to actually pay directly for people's fines and fees. So we're just not stopping. You know what I'm saying? It's like it took us 7-8 years to get on the ballot. Like where we're going to be in 7 or 8 years, I don't know. But today we're going to get up and we're going to hustle because we love returning citizens, and that's family, and we're going to figure this out. So we appreciate the question and just kind of the spirit behind it.
Well, thank you. And so Neil, Tanisha, Senator Brandis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ben.
Now for a discussion on the state of bail reform nationwide, please welcome Alec Karakatsanis, founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Corps. Please welcome back to the stage the Atlantic's Adrian Green.
Hi, Alec.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Great, thank you.
So you're litigating some of the major bail cases in the country right now. For those of us who might not be familiar, how does bail work in the country right now?
So to understand the American money bail system, I think it's really important just to take a step back and understand the scope of the pain that it's inflicting first. So as we sit here and talk today, there are about 500,000 human beings in a jail cell confined in pretrial detention. The vast majority of those human beings are in a jail cell prior to trial because they can't make a monetary payment. The reason for that money bail connection with pretrial detention is that the vast majority of the people that our legal system chooses to investigate and arrest and prosecute and confine are impoverished. And in 3,000 local jurisdictions all over the country, the predominant way in which we decide whether to put a human being in a jail cell or to let her go home with her family is whether she can come up with money. So the basic way that it works when you're arrested is probably best illustrated by an example. So I'll talk about our Harris County case in Houston, Texas. When we got to Harris County in 2016, if you were arrested for a misdemeanor or a felony offense, you were told you're free to go anytime. Just pay us some amount of money that was on a chart based on what you were charged with. And so if you didn't have the $500, if you didn't have the $1,000, you were confined to a jail cell. In the 5 years before we sued Harris County in 2016, 55 human beings died in the Harris County jail alone in downtown Houston because they couldn't afford to pay money bail. That year, there were 132 suicide attempts in the Harris County jail. It's really important to understand in the frantic and difficult and traumatic moments after you're arrested and told you're free to go back to your family, I'm trying to understand what it means to someone who can't get back to their families just because they can't hand Harris County some money. And so all over the country, we've been going around making a very simple argument. And that argument has lots of constitutional bells and whistles and technicalities and legal cases that we cite, but at the core, the argument is that no human being should be kept in a cage because she can't make a payment.
It's clear that the system doesn't work. When you're thinking about priorities, you talked about the bells and the whistles. What is the highest priority part of the system that needs to be reformed, in your opinion?
To me, I think first and foremost, it's the immense brutality that we're inflicting every single day. It's gotten to the point where it's so normalized that in 3,000, I remember when we told people 5 years ago we were going to start challenging the money bail system, people laughed at us because they would say, we're using it in 3,000 jurisdictions. That's what we do. This is how we do it. It can't be wrong. And yet, when you go into a jail and you see the kinds of things that happen to people in their bodies there, you have to remember, when you're kept in a jail cell because you can't pay money bail, you're highly likely to be sexually or physically assaulted, to be deprived of basic medical and mental health care, to be deprived of sunlight and fresh air, adequate food, all of the things that we all take for granted every single day, and more, right? I mean, we've talked a lot in the last year or year and a half about family separation at the border. Well, families are being separated every single day in every single city and town in this country because people can't pay money bail prior to their trial, prior to being convicted of anything. This family separation is happening to millions of families every single, and to me, that is an urgent situation that cries out. It cries out for all of us to understand the ways in which we're complicit, the ways in which the money bail system is functioning, and the ways in which we could very easily have a much more rational and humane system that didn't cage people just because they were poor. So for me, the highest priority is changing the narrative around the country to get people to understand what does it mean to tell someone that for the next 3 months or 5 months or 8 months or a year, not only can't you work or go back to your home or hug your child or go on a date or go to the theater, but you're going to be kept in this place that we have allowed to become a grotesque torture chamber, where any day you might be beaten, or any day you might get sick because of the lack of fresh air or exercise, and not be able to have an adequate doctor because we've privatized the healthcare in this facility. All of the things that we take for granted. And so for us at Civil Rights Corps, it's not just about making the best constitutional arguments, and we make really good constitutional arguments. We have some of the best arguments, as some might say. But we try fundamentally on a much more human level to change the cultural narrative. Because if you think back to some of the same-sex marriage cases, for example, very smart lawyers brought those cases 30, 35 years ago. They lost everywhere. They lost in the US Supreme Court on that issue. 25, 28, 30 years later, more lawyers came. They brought the same arguments about same-sex marriage to the same courts using the same few words in the 14th Amendment. And they won in the US Supreme Court. It wasn't because those lawyers were smarter than the previous lawyers. Some of them were the same lawyers. It was because we had a movement in this country that changed the way we all think about same-sex marriage. And what we're trying to do is be part of a movement that's predominantly led by the people who are most directly impacted by the money bail system and the rest of the punishment bureaucracy, to change the way all of us think about human caging, and to make sure that as a society, before we put someone in a cage and do all of the things that entails, we better have the most profoundly good reasons. And if we don't have a good reason, and not having money in your pocket is not a good reason. And we're trying to eradicate and abolish all of these systems, but starting with the systems that are founded on the racial and economic makeup of our society, and that make these decisions because of who people are and what they look like and how much wealth they have.
you look at these cases all over the country, and California was the first state to eliminate its cash bail system. Can you talk a little bit about the example that set for other states that are trying to follow in the footsteps of eradicating these policies?
I wish California were a positive story, but I think California is actually an example of why we should all be very afraid and why we're at a very dangerous moment in what is called the criminal justice reform movement. So California legislators got together and through a process that was highly secretive, essentially converted a pretty ambitious bail reform bill that would have eliminated the money bail industry and prevented a lot of pretrial detention. And at the last minute kind of substituted that with a bill that eliminates the money bail system in California, but replaces it with one that is highly likely to lead to more pretrial detention. Why is this important? I think if you don't understand the fundamental causes of why something like the money bail system developed, and I'll get to those causes in a second, I don't think you can come up with the right solutions. So what I'm very fearful of is that the system of money bail that we have in this country is going to morph into a system of pretrial detention, and that all of the people who are making money off the money bail system, like the multi-billion-dollar a year for-profit money bail industry, those same people, instead of selling you the bail bond, if you get out of jail, they're going to be selling you drug tests and electronic monitors so they can monitor everywhere you go and attach a device to you for $10 a day. And they're going to sell you for-profit supervision. So we're going to have all of the same people making all of the same or more money off the same impoverished populations, but using a different label. And this, I think, is the story of a lot of legal reform movements. Like, when we announced this landmark settlement in Harris County, Texas, Rodney Ellis, the prominent local legislator, likened it to Brown versus Board of Education. But one thing that you have to understand about Brown as a legal case, you can win a case that says it's unconstitutional to segregate schools. But 5 years after Brown, 10 years after Brown, 40 years after Brown, 60 years after Brown, you can actually have more segregation in much of the country in schools if you don't attack the underlying structural causes. So for the money bail system, what are the underlying structural causes of how we got to the point where, as a society, we have 400 to 500,000 human beings in a jail cell every night just because they can't pay, right? It sounds ridiculous when you actually look at it. When you talk to ordinary people, their mind is blown that we even have this. It's only lawyers that can come up with fancy explanations for why we created the system. Why did we create it? Well, one, I mentioned the profit motive. There's a lot of money to be made off impoverished people. The more, I think, fundamental point, though, is that no society in the recorded history of the modern world has ever tried to arrest such a high percentage of its population. When you arrest so many people, 12 million people every year, we're putting metal chains on, and we're putting them in police cars, and we're taking them to caging facilities, and we're processing them, and we're charging many of them with crimes. And no legal system that has ever been devised in world history can provide each one of those 12, 13 million people, depending on how you count, with the level of evidentiary, intellectual, and human rigor that it would require to give individual attention to all of their cases. What does our system do instead? It tries to process cases as fast as possible. It tries to process bodies. And the two things that the system has created that are most effective at that is the money bail system and the plea bargaining system. So well over 95% of cases all over the country end in plea bargains. How do we get so many people to take a bargain to get a criminal record, to get saddled with debt, and to spend time in a cage? Well, you put them in a cage and you tell them the only way or the quickest way to get out of that cage is to plead guilty. And so to take the Harris County example, again, like when we got there, they arrested 50,000 people, a little bit more, for misdemeanors every single year just in Harris County, Texas. 40% of them, over 20,000 people every single year, were detained for the entire duration of their case because they didn't have a couple $100s. Those 20,000 people, they pled guilty in a median of 3.2 days. So no attention was being given to their case. They didn't have a lawyer investigating their case or an investigator. No one was looking at what was going on. They didn't have discovery that was exchanged. They could see what the allegations were. They were told at their first court date, if you can pay money, you're released. They couldn't pay money, so they were kept in jail. And then at their next court date, in a couple of days, they were told if you want to get out of jail, and the vast majority of them did, plead guilty. You'll get out today or tomorrow.
So does that make lawmakers and judges kind of complicit in the system as it operates?
It makes all of us complicit. This is happening in all of our names. There's no question that lawmakers and judges and prosecutors and public defenders and all of us who've worked in the system have been complicit in it. I worked as a public defender for 4.5 years in two of the most prestigious offices in the country. And To my knowledge, neither of those two offices filed a single bail appeal in the entire 4.5 years I was there. We all became so desensitized to how brutal it is to put a human being in a cage. And think about what that means for people going through the system. The people who could afford money bail in Harris County, the 30,000 people who paid a for-profit bail bond company a few $100s, so they extracted about $6-7 million a year in wealth from those populations. But those people who could pay, they were 51% likely to never get convicted of anything. That's the two justice systems that we had, and their cases lasted 120 days. So the rich who could afford to get out of jail, their cases, and the reason the money bail system was created is that the system couldn't possibly give that kind of attention to all of the people that it's arresting. And so unless we confront those underlying dynamics, I'm very, very worried that we'll see something like what happened in California. And to take your question back to California, one of the most pernicious aspects of the California law is that it tries to expand who is eligible to be detained prior to trial. So it says, we're not going to detain you because you're poor, but we're going to expand the reasons and the types of cases that we can just detain you for no reason, or any reason, right? Because you're dangerous, or because you're a risk of flight. And moreover, we're going to let prosecutors and judges decide to delay 9 business days if they want until you even have a hearing about whether you're dangerous or a flight risk. So there's a reason why many counties in California estimated that their jail populations would increase after this. And I think the precedent for this is very chilling. There was a federal bail reform movement. A lot of people like me coming out in the 1960s, fancy lawyers saying, this is so unfair and unjust, and we've got to get rid of cash bail in the federal courts. Bobby Kennedy led this movement, right? Lyndon Johnson spoke about it at the White House. They had panels of judges. The federal system, when the federal system eventually ended the money bail system in federal courts with the Bail Reform Act of 1984, when that act went into effect, about 24% of all federal criminal defendants were detained prior to trial because they couldn't afford bail. A really serious problem. Today, as I sit here talking to you, we don't detain people anymore in federal court because they can't pay. But 72.4% of all federal criminal defendants are detained prior to trial. So we got rid of the money bail issue, but we tripled the rate at which people were detained in federal court. And it's the same populations that we're arresting and detaining. It's disproportionately people of color and almost all poor people. That's what I'm afraid of.
I have a final question for you. Money bail has often been referred to in its early iterations as something that was done for public safety. And we kind of know that that is not necessarily true. What would it take to reimagine a system that does take public safety as its kind of first and foremost goal?
Yeah, so the whole criminal punishment bureaucracy has been sold to us as a matter of public safety. When you actually look at what's going on in that bureaucracy, that's laughable, right? Only 4% of the arrests, according to the FBI in this country, are for things that the FBI calls violent offenses. The vast bulk of the criminal punishment bureaucracy is controlling certain populations and managing other types of social problems like mental illness and drug addiction and poverty. So it's just a false narrative to begin with for many reasons that we don't have time to get into here. In terms of the money bail system, it's even more ridiculous because if everybody who even thinks about it for a second understands that paying some money doesn't make you safe. If you were someone who believed that there was someone dangerous, why in the world would you think that them paying you $100, which they don't even lose if they commit a crime? You can't actually lose your money bail even if you commit a murder while you're out on release. The only way you lose your money bail is if you don't come back to court. What we know from all of the research actually is that keeping someone in jail for just a couple of days, even 24 hours, 48 hours, makes them more likely to commit crime in the future and more likely not to appear in court in the future. Why? Because you've destabilized their life. I can take an afternoon off to come to the Atlantic Ideas Festival. I'm not going to get fired from our organization, I don't think. But many of my clients, as a public defender and as a civil rights lawyer, they can't miss two days of shifts. If they get jailed because they can't pay $100, they're going to lose their job. They might lose their bed in the homeless shelter. They might lose their housing. Many of them don't have any idea where their children are. These are the kinds of things that destabilize lives. If you're on very important medication for an illness or a mental health issue and you get interrupted for 2, 3, 4, 6 days and put in a traumatic environment, that can send you into a spiral that can have enormous effects. And so that's why all of the research shows there are so many better ways that we can address the trauma and pain and poverty and the reasons that people find themselves in our vast criminal punishment bureaucracy. We don't need to cage them because they're poor.
Alec, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alec and Adrian, and thank you to all of our speakers and moderators today, and thanks to all of you for spending the afternoon with us. Please join us tonight for our festival closing event, a special production of Pop-Up Magazine. You're not gonna wanna miss this one. See you over there.